This is the Dollemore Daily, and I'm Jesse Dollemore. We've been good at a lot in America. Really good. Unfortunately, some of the things we've been exceptional at have been at the expense of people who don't look like me. We not only ran indigenous people off their land that we promised to them after stealing their other land, we also dispatched troops who murdered thousands of their daughters and sons, and sisters and brothers, and mothers and fathers. We imprisoned nearly 150,000 people, many of them American citizens, without the charge of a crime or conviction following trial, whose only offense was being born Japanese and being alive during World War II. We've gravely mistreated many groups for no other reason than they took up space in our white world. While I don't like treating the various historical injustices visited upon the myriad of groups of people in this nation like some kind of tragedy Olympics, it must be recognized that no group has suffered systemic indignities like blacks in America. Between 1525 and 1866, 12.5 million Africans were kidnapped from their homes and shipped to what was then referred to as the New World. And when I say kidnapped from their homes, I don't speak in some nebulous terms about their homelands. I mean their homes. They were kidnapped from the places that they slept, the places where they should have been the safest, the places where they built a life, where they played as children and met women or men that they'd marry, the places they'd have kids and watch them to grow and repeat the same natural cycle. 12.5 million human beings taken against their will. And only 10.7 million survived the abduction, meaning that 15% of the people didn't survive the brutality of the trip across the Atlantic. And those who did survive the journey were greeted by their white oppressors with rape and torture and murder. It's been said before, but obviously bears repeating, it is okay to change one's mind when confronted with new information. But also, and further, it's okay to change one's mind when confronted with new understanding of information that has existed unchanged for centuries. Those of you who listen to my podcast will know because I talk about it pretty regularly. But for the many of you that do not know, I used to be a Republican. I was raised in a hyper-conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical Christian household by parents who are at this very moment conservative Christian Donald Trump loyalists. I was raised with a white Christian nationalism ideology, one that has slowly taken shape over the course of the past few decades to become a dominant and driving cross-section of the Republican voter base. So I was someone who used to think about the issue of reparations with arguments like these from Mitch McConnell the other day.
Yeah, I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago for whom none of us currently living are responsible is a good idea. We've tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We've elected an African-American president. I think we're always a work in progress in this country, but no one currently alive was responsible for that. And I don't think we should be trying to figure out how to compensate for it. First of all, it'd be pretty hard to figure out who to compensate. We've had waves of immigrants as well who've come to the country and experienced dramatic discrimination of one kind or another. So no, I don't think reparations are a good idea.
Statements like this, to many, seem reasonable, logical. I've changed my mind about them, and I want to explain why. Why this argument no longer works for me, and why I believe it shouldn't work for you either. Let's address them one by one with a better, more comprehensive eye on history and also on the facts. McConnell says the thing about no one being alive today who implemented the hideous and morally unjustifiable practice of slavery. In that, he's asserting that we, America, founded by and governed by white men, and we, America, the same nation that caused the harm, did the damage, and created an economy and a system of laws which incentivize the ownership of our fellow man, that we, America, should be off the hook because the very same nation governed by white men was able to, because of the power structure, ignore the very harm and damage over the course of that 150 years. Listen, being good at avoiding consequence doesn't absolve our nation of guilt, and it certainly doesn't erase the debt. All 150 years of ignoring it does is compound interest on that debt. Compounded interest in the way of pain and trauma, and compounded interest on that unpaid debt. He also said that we've tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation, and even by electing an African American president. Those things aren't repaying a debt. Those things are merely the bare minimum related to human decency and basic civil rights. Mitch McConnell listed those things like he deserves an award for them, for the bare minimum. And then he repeats the same point that we're always a work in progress in this country, but no one currently alive was responsible for slavery. And while that is true, there isn't a single soul alive who's responsible for implementing or participating in slavery. There are certainly millions of white American families who've reaped the benefits, the financial benefits through inheritance and the brutal systems of white supremacy which followed the Civil War, which is just common sense that white families have had a massive, several hundred-year head start in wealth building and wealth accumulation. Because as it stands currently, the median net worth of whites remains nearly 10 times the size of blacks' net worth. And nearly 1 in 5 black families have zero or negative net worth, which is twice the rate of white families. This is about an opportunity to save money and to grow wealth and to build something enough to leave to a future generation in order that they can compound upon what was left to them and hopefully continue an intergenerational cycle. But as it stands now, when was that supposed to have begun? And let's talk about that. I hear all the time about how blacks in this country should just quit whining, that this is 2019 and the negative ramifications as a result of the hundreds of years of clear immorality and brutality should just be set aside because no one's a slave now. Just days before the Civil War officially ended, General William Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15. Although not called it, in this order, a first attempt was made at a form of reparations. It was intended to give 40,000 newly freed former slaves 40 acres each of roughly 400,000 acres, which is confiscated from traitorous Confederate slaveholders. The plan was approved by President Abraham Lincoln and then subsequently canceled by his successor, Southerner Andrew Johnson. And to add insult to injury, not only did black former slaves get nothing, Johnson made certain that white slaveholders were made whole, were made financially whole. Reparations, but not for former slaves, reparations for rich white slaveholders. After the Civil War, blacks were kept poor and with almost zero ability to grow wealth. Thousands of black prisoners were leased by Southern states to former slave owners in what were called convict leases, where blacks again worked for free, while white men made themselves rich on their broken backs. There was also sharecropping, which grossly exploited black labor while allowing former slaveholders to maintain their power and to continue to grow their wealth. And again, ultimately pass it on to future generations of their white descendants. Of course, during this entire time, there were Jim Crow laws in place all over the South, which made it illegal by law for Black Americans to occupy the same space as whites. Hospitals, bathrooms, public buildings, elevators, phone booths, restaurants, water fountains, everything white, which was everything, was off limits for Black Americans. Jim Crow laws also intended to force Black people into indentured servitude, to limit their voice in the political system by stripping away their constitutional rights to vote, to control where they live. It was the American legal system explicitly designed for oppressing them. And listen, much like today, after the Civil War, when dudes got out of the military, they gravitated to jobs within the legal system. Many former Confederate soldiers took jobs as police and even judges to make certain there was no justice at any level for Black citizens. And thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Black Americans who found themselves in the crosshairs of those enforcing Jim Crow laws were met with violence and death through lynching. And the few Black communities that were able to band together and prosper, accumulating wealth, were targeted by white men and destroyed. An example of this would be what took place in the early 20s in Tulsa, Oklahoma's Greenwood district, better known as Black Wall Street. It wasn't just Jim Crow, though. Blacks returning from valiant, brave combat military service in World War II were once again betrayed by the country they had just served when they didn't get full access to their GI Bill benefits and weren't even able to take part in wealth-building programs offered through the New Deal. And when someone was able to scrape together enough money to buy a home, they were precluded from buying one because of calculated, discriminatory housing practices called redlining. So tell me, Mitch McConnell, or anybody else for that matter, when was any effort at all made to make things right with the Black community? When? The system, from the very beginning, was designed by white people for white people. And the time-honored practice of our government being good at avoiding consequence only continues to add to the debt that is most assuredly owed. Are reparations going to be easy? Of course not. But what thing of great value and impact has ever come easy? It is time for white Americans to take a second look at the history of our country. Let the scales fall from your eyes and see clearly the history here. No, you're probably not responsible for what took place 150 years ago or 75 or 50, but it is likely that you've benefited in some way from the system that was designed to benefit you while specifically excluding others. Again, this isn't about letting go of the past or hating America, because I believe wholeheartedly in the ideals enshrined in our Constitution that gave life to an experiment in democracy and freedom on this continent. But it took us hundreds of years before we started actually codifying and enforcing equality into our system of law. We must be clear-eyed about the context of our history in this nation. And to fail to do so is moral failure.